Okay, this may be everybody, so I'll go ahead and start. Welcome everybody to our webinar on budgets and reserve studies. My name is Danielle Frederick. I'm the new business development manager here at Kirkpatrick. And some of you guys may have been with Kirkpatrick 5, 10, 15 years, but for our newer communities and our newer board members, just a little bit about KMC. We are a family-owned local business. Our headquarters is at 71st and Binnford, and we are an accredited management company. That is a designation we got through CAI, which is an international organization for HOA management. And we will be celebrating 50 years in business next year, so we're really proud of that. Just a couple housekeeping items today before we get started. Everyone will be muted on the call and you cannot unmute yourself. So if you have questions, you should see a Q&A section. Please put your questions in the Q&A and we will do our best to answer those as those come in. So a few announcements. Our next webinar is going to be September 1st at 6 p.m. and this is going to be over annual meetings. So you guys will get more information on that in the next coming this week and next week with your monthly financials. So make sure you keep your eye out for that. And then I wanted to take just a brief moment to talk about our new Customer Cares program. So many of you may have already spoken with Kelly Soto. She is our Director of Client Relations. And what she's doing with our Customer Cares program is she is proactively reaching out to our boards, mostly board presidents, and she's just kind of checking in to make sure that we are meeting or exceeding your guys' expectations. So we value customer service. It's one of our top priorities. And so this program is just another way that we're touching base with our boards and making sure everything's going okay, getting some good feedback and constructive feedback too, if we need it. So be on the lookout for her emails. Like I said, she primarily communicates with the board president. So that's something new that we've just rolled out this year. And now I will go into introducing our speakers. So we have Matt Shergalis, I think I said it right. And he is the founder of Village Reserve, which is a organization, a business in Central Indiana that does reserve studies for HOAs. And he actually served on his HOA board as the board president. So he totally understands how HOAs work and kind of the board's perspective on things, which is really beneficial. So in his free time, Matt likes to golf and cycle, but he hasn't really been able to do much of that because him and his wife welcomed a baby boy in February. So before we started this, Matt and I were talking about how crazy life can be now. So that is Matt, and he will be covering the reserve study topic today. And then we also have Stephanie Soroky, who is one of our regional managers. And Stephanie's been with Kirkpatrick about 5 years. She's been doing property management for about 14 years. And we are super duper proud and excited for Stephanie because she just recently passed her PCAM. If you guys don't know what that is, it stands for Professional Community Association Manager. And it is the highest level of designation you can get through CAI. So basically what happens is she was assigned a community, a real community, and then was asked a series of questions about the management of that property. So when it's all said and done, the report that she put together and had to submit was close to 200 pages. So it's a very big deal. We're very proud of her and super excited, like I said. So in her free time, she likes to spend time with her family, which includes 5 grandkids, which I know all of us are thinking the same thing. Like, how is this possible that this young lady has 5 grandkids? We haven't been able to figure it out, but it's true. She does. So with that being said, Stephanie, I think I'll turn it over to you and you can kind of start talking about budgets.
All right. Thank you, Danielle. And thank you, everybody, for joining us on this rainy afternoon in August. Thank you for taking your lunch hour for this topic. I know that budgeting and reserve setting is not the most glamorous of topics to talk about, but they are topics that are near and dear to my heart. And anybody who works in the office with me, they know how much I love these topics. So hopefully we'll have a couple of converts by the end of the session. So just a quick review of today's agenda. We're going to talk, about the budgeting process. So what you need to do to gather to get your budget started. We're going to talk about your operating budget, your reserve budget, and then we're going to wrap up with a conversation with Matt about the importance of a reserve study. Can't say enough. I tell all of my boards, it's the best money you will ever spend. So that's kind of our agenda for today. We will get right into it. We've already taken care of the introduction. So let's just jump right into budgeting. So every association has to do a budget every year. The power of approving the budget is going to be determined by your governing documents. For some HOAs, that is the board of directors. You guys create the budget, you approve the budget, and you send the coupons out telling your homeowners what their assessments are going to be for the next year. But in other associations, the membership has to approve the budget. So it's really important that you have homeowner buy-in. So that transparency that we're always talking about, that you're sharing with the homeowners what's going on throughout the year, so that when it comes time to present next year's budget, they're really prepared and bought into what that's going to look like. Now, boards have a duty. So you have a duty to create a budget that adequately provides for the association's day-to-day needs, as well as for long-term reserve planning. I know people will say, well, I'm not going to be here 10 years from now. I'm not going to be here 20 years from now. But we still have to be thinking that far ahead so that we can preserve, maintain, and enhance the association. And unfortunately, when we don't do that adequately, that could be considered a breach of the board's fiduciary duty. So presenting and preparing a budget that's adequate and it really takes into account all of the association's needs is really vital to the health and welfare of the association. We all manage not-for-profit communities. So at the end of the day, we're not here to show a profit on the books. We're not here to show a loss. If we break even, that's a good budget. That's the best kind of budget to end up with at the end of the year. All right, so let's talk about how we get started with all of this. In order to sit down and do a budget, you need to have some information on hand. So having your current year's budget obviously makes some sense. You want to have your most recent set of financials so that you know how much money you've spent and how much you've collected so far this year. Making sure that we've got copies of all of your current contracts for your recurring services. So that's things like landscaping, pools, and ponds. It might be irrigation. For condominiums, you might have additional contracts for things like equipment maintenance, pest control, security, and safety. If you have contracts that are expiring, hopefully you've got proposals for those expiring contracts so that you know what next year's expense is going to be. You'll want to make sure you have on hand prior year-end actual expenditures or historical trends. So we'll talk about this a little bit more later, but having 2, 3, or more years worth of actual year-end numbers is really important to be able to see how the history of the association has trended. You want to look at expected utility increases. Is Duke planning a major infrastructure overhaul for next year? And is that going to be reflected in utility costs? Is Citizens expanding their services? So understanding utility increases can have a huge impact on your budget for the coming year. And then last but not least, you want to have a reserve study. Reserve study is going to help you with those long-term plans, how much money you're going to need to save and how much money you're going to be spending over the course of the next 10, 20, or 30 years. So once you get all that information put together, next step is to really think about what your goals are. So as a board, sit down and talk about your short-term plans. In the next 1 to 2 years, what do you really want to focus on? What are the community's immediate needs? But then also looking beyond that. So looking out 3 to 10 years or possibly longer, what is the association going to need? The better you plan for the long term, the better defense you're going to have against those significant and sometimes potentially unexpected expenses. So it's going to allow you to position yourselves to really thrive in the future. So you're not going to have that conversation that, oh my goodness, we didn't expect this. How are we going to afford to pay for that? So that's kind of short and long-term planning. I always like to talk a little bit about assessments right here. I know some associations really pride themselves on not increasing assessments year over year. I'm going to encourage you to, hopefully by the end of this, rethink that. I really like to encourage my boards and my associations to increase their assessments annually, even in small increments. It allows you to really match the changing needs of the community. And it's a lot easier, I think, for the homeowners to take in the long run. Increases that are in larger amounts are usually a lot harder to deal with, and the homeowners don't always understand that. I always like to tell the story of a community that we manage that for 15 years they didn't do increases. The board was super proud of that they had managed to hold their assessments solid for 15 years. Well, year 16 comes along, we crunched the numbers, and we realized that we needed to do a $25 increase per quarter, so less than $10 per month. Pretty nominal. However, because the homeowners were not accustomed to having those increases, the phone did not stop ringing for a month after their coupons and their budget notices went out for the coming year. People were just incensed that there was an increase. So I do think that, make my little soapbox speech here. If you can do small annual increases, I think it'll just be a lot easier for the homeowners in the long run. All right, so let's talk about developing line items. So you've set your goals for the next few years. You've got all your paperwork together. Now you really need to figure out what line items go into your budget. So first of all, you've got your obligations. Those are the things that you have to do, and those are required by your governing documents. So insurance is an example. You may be required to provide landscaping for the association, possibly snow removal, taxes that you would have to pay. Those are the things that you have to do that your governing documents require. You may have amenities that you have to maintain. So once you've developed the obligations, now you can look at the needs. So what does the community need? So going back to, maintaining amenities, say you have a pool. Well, that pool requires service. Somebody has to maintain that pool during the season. So that would be a need. If you have a clubhouse with a fitness center, you may have to have a contract to maintain that equipment in order to prolong its life. So that would be the next level that you would want to look at. And then finally, you're going to want to look at the association's expectations. So again, going back to that pool, when do the homeowners expect the pool to open and when do they expect it to close? Some pools are Memorial Day to Labor Day. Other pools, maybe it's heated and the membership wants that pool open on May 1st and they want to keep it open until the end of October. So understanding those expectations will also impact your budget. The fitness center, is it open Monday through Friday during specific hours, or is it open 24 hours a day? And if so, how do homeowners get access to that? And what are the costs involved with maintaining that access system? So obligations, needs, and expectations in order of importance. All right, so now we're going to get into actually sitting down and creating the budget. Again, we've got all of our paperwork in front of us. We've talked about our plans, and we've decided on what our line items are going to be based on obligation, need, and expectation. So you're going to sit down. You've got that blank form staring at you. First thing I'm going to suggest is go ahead and put your year-end data from your financial reports in there. 2 years or more worth of historical data is really important in helping you figure out what those trends are. Then we're going to want to add a next column. So your year-to-date figures from your current financials. What is your current income and expenses? What is your current annual budget? And then finally, we're going to project forward to what the end of this year looks like. So we're going to be looking at contracted expenses when we're looking at projections. So in that case, those are the easy line items, right? Because your projected expense should match your contracted total. Other line items are going to be your non-fixed expenses. So utilities, maintenance, administrative costs. And that's where we're going to, for that projection for year end, we're going to be looking at calculating averages. So say, for example, as of the end of July, you've spent $700 on administrative expense. $700 divided by the 7 months gives you an average monthly expense of $100. Multiply that by 12. That means your projected expense for administrative is probably going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of $1,200 for the remainder of this year. And then again, for some of those expenses, you may also look at historical data. Sometimes I'll be honest with you, the whole divide by the number of months and then multiply by 12 doesn't always work out. You might get some really crazy numbers there. So then you may want to go back and look at historical data and help you really kind of adjust that number. So again, there's that formula, your year-to-date actual expense divided by the number of months, multiply that by 12. Okay. Now we're ready to actually start on next year's budget. You've done all of your homework. You've got everything all lined up. You've got all of your historical data. You've got your contracts and your bids in front of you. I always like to start with my expenses. I know that may seem kind of odd because you're thinking, well, why don't we start with income? Let's figure how much we want our assessments to be. I prefer to start with the expenses and figure out instead how much money we're going to need. And then I kind of back my way into how that translates to assessments. And because I like to start my budget with the easiest way possible, I will always start with my fixed contracted expenses. First thing I'm going to plug in is my landscaping, pool, pond, and all of those recurring preventative maintenance type contracts. Most of the rest of your line items then you're going to develop using that historical data and this year's forecast to project those numbers forward into the following year. So again, using that administrative expense as an example, say in previous years you've spent $1,000 in one year, $1,200 the next, $1,500 last year. This year you're projecting $1,200. Add all that up, divide it by 4, and that gives you an average annual expense for the 4 years of about $1,225. That's probably a good place to start for 2023, and then you can kind of adjust. I will say there's a lot of just instinctive knowledge of the association that will really help you develop a budget. But this is a good starting place, and then you can kind of go back and adjust those individual line items. Next, you're going to add in your reserve contribution. If you've got a reserve study, this is easy. You're going to go to your reserve study and it's going to tell you that for 2023, your projected reserve contribution should be X number of dollars. And let's go ahead and plug that number in. And then last but not least, I'm going to ask you to consider contingency expenses. We run zero balance budgets. These are not profit budgets. So at the end of the day, every penny that you're planning to spend is counted for in the assessments that you're planning on collecting. That doesn't always leave a lot of room for the unexpected unless you plan for that. So I would encourage you to consider having some sort of contingency expense, whether it's a common area contingency, maybe it's a building maintenance contingency for those unexpecteds. A couple of years ago, a big storm came through, knocked down several trees in one of my associations, and to the cost of about $7,500. If we didn't have a contingency expense, we might have really struggled to figure out how to pay for that without having to potentially dip into the reserves or impact other line items. So it's always good to have a little bit of cushion in your budget that way. Once you get all of your expenses added in, then again, we're going to back up and we're going to calculate what your income needs to be. Like I said, I always like to think about how much money we're going to need, and then I figure out how that's going to impact assessments. So I'm going to take those total expenses, say it's $500,000 for the year, we'll divide it by the number of homes or lots that you have, and then we're going to divide that by whatever your billing cycle is, and then that should give you your assessment. From there, you can compare that to previous year's assessments and make adjustments if you need to. Now, we haven't talked yet about ancillary or miscellaneous income because I always consider that to be found money with my associations. Typically things like late fees or key card fees, they're generally not big numbers anyway. And it's not usually money that I can count on coming in to fill the association's coffers. So I will budget for those items, but I typically tend to build that dollar amount back into my contingency expense rather than say, hey, we need those late fees in order to be able to pay the electric bill. So that's kind of my approach to ancillary income. Now, some of you do have associations where you may have guaranteed miscellaneous income. You may have dock fees or you may have garage fees. That's a little bit different situation. You can count on that income a little bit more consistently, but otherwise I would consider most of your miscellaneous income. Try to, if you can, build that into your contingency rather than counting on it. Because, hey, what if your late fees are less next year than you had budgeted? That way it won't negatively impact any of your planned expenses. And then, like I said before, last but not least, the goal is to get that final balance to zero. Income and expenses should equal each other out. And then that is your operating budget. For most of your associations, probably takes a couple of hours to put the actual operating budget together. You're probably not starting from scratch. I mean, as I've kind of discussed here, you've got historical data, you've probably even got a budget format already kind of set up. So a couple of hours should get you to this point, and then you can go back and make the adjustments that you need to make. Now we're going to move on for a few moments and talk about the reserve budget. Reserve budget's generally a little bit easier. You've got fewer line items to have to deal with than in your operating budget. And it's really easy if you've got a reserve study, because you can go back to that reserve study and you're going to review and add the planned projects to your budget worksheet. So your reserve study is going to tell you that these are your projects for 2023. This is how much money you need to spend on those. And you'll make some business decisions, and then you'll decide which of those projects are actually going to make it into the budget for next year. And then, of course, your reserve interest and income, those are going to come off of the funding plan on your study as well. So your reserve specialist has laid all of that out, and they've taken some of the guesswork out of that for you. Now, if you don't have a reserve study, it's a little bit more work, but you can still get there. So first thing you need to do is really talk about what are the capital projects that you want to do next year? What is it that you guys want to get accomplished? And then you're going to need to get some RFPs out so that you can get bids back to help you establish those numbers. Unless you've got some really good, solid historical data, it may be a lot harder if you don't have a reserve study to try to figure out what is that asphalt going to cost? How much money should we budget for concrete type of thing? And then last but not least, I'll tell you, consider having a reserve study done, because I'll tell you, it's a lot of work and it is the best money that you will ever spend, in my opinion, to help take some of the guesswork out of that. I love being able to stand up in front of a group of homeowners and show them this professional reserve study and how the board is really looking forward and taking care of the association. So that's your reserve budget. Now let's talk for a minute about timeline. When does all of this stuff need to happen? Well, for most of your associations, it's already started. It probably started with your managers behind the scenes, and you might not even have realized it. But what I will say for boards, I definitely challenge you on an ongoing basis every single month. Take time to review your budget, review the financials that we send out, look at them in detail. I know it's easy to drop right to the bottom line and say, hey, we're either above or under budget. But I definitely encourage you to look at your line items. Make sure that you understand when you do have a variance, why do you have a variance? Because then when it's time to sit down and have the budget conversation, there's no surprises. You already know what you need to do for the coming year. But as far as the actual budgeting process is concerned, a couple of months ago in June, that's when your manager started reviewing contracts. They started working on RFPs for your landscaping, pool, and your other recurring contracted expenses. They probably started drafting your budgets last month, might have been the end of last month, but they would have started actually filling in all of those blanks for you, reviewing your returned proposals, making sure that everything is in a good position to be presenting to you all so that you can start making those big decisions for the coming year. So this month, hopefully sometime, you're going to be getting the first draft of your budgets. Now, for some of you boards who do your own budgets, that's awesome. We are happy to work with you and help make that process as easy as possible. But we'll be presenting first drafts at your upcoming board meetings so that we can really kind of start fine-tuning all of that. At the end of the day, these are your budgets. We're going to give you the numbers that we think work for you, but ultimately you guys have to make the decision as board members that's going to be the best fit for your community. And then last but not least, we started this last year. We're asking our boards as much as possible to try to get your budgets finalized and approved by the end of October, so that in November, we can start mailing your coupons out. That's a big process for us internally. We use an outside vendor to actually create the coupons. So there's always a lot of back and forth with the vendor, working within their timeline. So the earlier that we can get budgets finalized and those coupon requests going, the quicker we can get that out to your homeowners. And certainly if you're expecting a fee increase for next year, your governing documents probably require you to give a 30-day written notice to your homeowners. So getting those coupons in the mail before December 1st, along with the budget notices, is going to be really important in terms of that timeline. Now, if you have an association that has a different timeline because your governing documents require it, that's fine. We will work with you. But if you're used to doing your annual meetings in November, I would encourage you to try to consider moving those up a little bit earlier if you're asking homeowners to vote to approve the budget, just so that we can make sure that we have plenty of time to finish that process for you. So that's kind of the budget timeline that we have. And I believe that brings me to the end of my presentation. Last thing I'll just say is closing remarks before we go to questions here is that, we're kind of living in unprecedented times. And I'm sure you guys know, this is no surprise. Next year's budgets might be a little bit different conversation. We're seeing lots of increases in the costs of goods and services, and that may impact your associations. We're here to partner with you to help make sure that you get the right budget for your associations. And then if we need to have some conversations with your homeowners and help you guys kind of set that expectation, that's exactly what we are here for. So with that, Dan, do we have any questions about budgeting?
We do have some questions. Can you hear me okay, Stephanie?
Yes, absolutely.
We do have some questions. There's just one of them that I had not been asked before, and I had a question on, and I hadn't. It says from Paula Moore, we are updating our covenants. Can we add an annual percentage increase annually that we don't need homeowners to approve every year? I had not seen that before, but I didn't know if either one of you have seen that.
I haven't seen that, but I think it's a great question. On some levels, I like the idea, but on other levels, I'm also concerned that it could be too restricting. Again, we're in kind of unprecedented times, and I have seen associations that have governing documents that limit the amount of their increase, and those associations are struggling. So I think it's something that you guys need to talk to your attorney about. And definitely it may be very well dependent on what the association's financial position is. But I don't know, that's a hard one. Matt, do you have anything you'd like to add on that one?
Yeah, I saw the question come in. It's very interesting. If it's an association where the power to approve budgets is with the members, right? And it takes a vote of all of the members to pass a budget increase. And then the covenants are silent on what do we do if the budget doesn't pass by a majority or whatever, 2/3 vote of our owners. Then we may want to think about adding some language in. I'd hate to take power away from the board, right? Or really start to be restrictive on what the board can do in that decision-making process. Again, unless we have to have, the members approve the increase or any budget, and then the covenants become silent from there. At that point, you'd want to probably clean up the language and add something.
Okay, there's one other question. The rest of them are about the reserves, I believe. So a couple other ones, but this is from Daniel Schlegel. With runaway inflation, how are you projecting cost increases for utilities, maintenance, groundskeeping, things like that?
So with the utilities, we are trying to check in with the utility companies and trying to get their projections as best as we can. I think Duke is already projecting a 7% increase for next year. So we are really counting on them to feed us some numbers. And then with some of the other things, I think we're looking in large part at the CPI. The Consumer Price Index is a guiding factor. Contracted services, obviously, we're getting bids back for those. And I know for one of my communities, The landscaping bids that I got back were quite shocking in the amount of increase that we're potentially looking at. So we're also going to get a little bit creative with that. I don't know that there's an exact formula. I think we're going to try to help you guys do the best that we can, but I think we'll probably all be relying to some extent on the consumer price index. Matt, what would you suggest to that?
Yeah, that's a good data source to go to. All of the in our neighborhood, we're getting information back from all the utilities. We're reaching out, so that 7% from Duke makes sense. Our natural gas, I think, is going to double. It's becoming very expensive. In terms of the contracts, you know, a lot of our contracts, we try and sign 2-3 year fixed price agreements with our vendors at that point. That hasn't stopped them from trying to break the contract and saying that we need to come back and ask for more money. Those are typically on the order of, we're seeing about 10 to 18% increases in those contracts. We really want to get the process and the information from those vendors early and often so we can have those discussions and really start to build it into the budget process on the front end instead of actually going through the budget, getting it all set, squared away, feeling good about it, and then after the fact, having the vendors come back in and saying, "Hey, we have to do an increase in our contract."
Yeah, I would agree. And I think for some of the larger capital projects, it may be hard for vendors to commit, 6-8 months in advance to a price when they don't know what the cost of asphalt is going to be or the cost of concrete is going to be next year. But I think it certainly doesn't hurt us to get bids and say, okay, in today's market, it's going to cost X. And then we may need to project another 10 to 20% on top of that to pad that budget. And that kind of goes back to that contingency discussion. If you can build a little bit of padding into the budget, while it may raise assessments, in my opinion, I would rather collect a little bit more from the homeowners, have the extra money and not need it than not have it and have to come back mid-year and say, we need to do a special assessment, or we need to consider potentially sacrificing services in order to be able to stay on budget.
Okay, then one last question. I think you can go to Matt, but and this is just kind of a question for the CPI is a good measure. However, PPI is what will drive the CPI. Matt, do you have any thoughts on that?
When you say PPI, you're talking about the producer price index, correct?
I would imagine it says, yes.
Yeah, so really where you look in terms of what inflation is, right? It really is varying. You hear 8.6, 9.1, you can go CPI, PPI. I personally like to look at the producer price index. It's kind of a subset of and it's the producer price index for residential construction inputs. So it's dealing with products that we as a neighborhood would be dealing with. It's asphalt shingles, it's concrete, right? It's asphalt pavement. So I think it's a better subset and better representation of what prices are doing within our market. And that information is available through the Federal Reserve of St. Louis. You can type it in and maybe I'll throw a link up at the end if you're interested in seeing what that inflation number is looking like.
Okay, and I think the rest of the questions will be either answered during the reserve portion or I will ask them afterwards. So I appreciate your time, guys. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So with that, we will go on to Matt and reserve funding and reserve studies.
Yeah, thank you. I'm seeing a lot of good questions coming in, so we're gonna go pretty quickly through this because I think the questions are going to be really good discussion points. So definitely want to leave time there. But we want to start by talking about reserve fund and then what it is, and then how it feeds into, or how a reserve study, maybe conversely better, feeds into the actual reserve fund. So what is the reserve fund? It's the portion of each homeowner's assessment set aside each year and used for the repair, replacement, and enhancement of our neighborhood assets. So the way I like to think about it is each of our homeowners, we have an assessment, it's a total assessment, and then we can break that apart into our operating fund, which Stephanie did a great job of talking about. It includes our contracts with our vendors, kind of that operational contingency, our utilities and the like. And then we have the other half of it, which is our reserve fund, which funds the use of capital improvement projects. So next slide. So I think it's also important to talk about what the reserve fund is not. It's almost as important as what a reserve fund is. It's not a rainy day fund, and it's not a budget surplus. So all of the money that we put into our reserve fund, we can think of it as being allocated. We'll get into it, but our reserve study helps us establish what that allocation needs to be. So as we go through our budget process, what we don't want to be doing is thinking of the reserve fund, again, as rainy day or budget surplus that we can fill in budget shortfalls on a yearly basis instead of increasing our dues. That's certainly when we get into budget season this year with the inflation pressure we're seeing, it would be pretty easy to say as board members, let's reduce the reserve fund, the money that we're putting into the reserve fund this year, just slightly, right? So that we don't have to increase our dues as much as we may anticipate them being if we had not done that. So, and in addition to that, when we think about our total reserve fund, right, we also don't want to think of it as this pot of money that we could kind of burn from, right? Instead of raising our dues, we could have kind of a deficit spend and pull from that total accumulated reserve fund at that point, again, to try, in effect, hold our dues from needing to increase. So next slide. So if you're new to the board and financial statements, I think it's pretty important to talk about where we actually find the reserve fund on the different financial documents that we'll be looking at as we go into this budget season. So there's two real places that we'll see the reserve fund. We'll notice the total amount on the balance sheet. It's both an asset and an equity. It could be, in some cases, pretty easy to identify, may say reserve fund, and then provide the balance. If you are a part of a larger community that has a large reserve fund, you may end up having to take that pot of money and invest it in different vehicles, CDs, treasuries, right? Probably not stocks. But at that case, it may be a little more difficult to identify what that total amount of the reserve fund is and where it's actually located, because it may actually say what that investment vehicle is on the balance sheet instead of just a simple reserve fund. We'll also find the yearly contribution that we're going to make to the reserve account on our P&L, profit loss statement, really is one of two ways. You could find it in a smaller community as an expense line item. We'll simply term it a reserve fund transfer. And in that sense, we'll treat it kind of as the expense that we put away and save for a rainy day. In larger communities, you may actually break out your P&L statement. So remember on the first slide, we showed the operating fund and the reserve fund. You could have an operating P&L and a reserve fund P&L statement. And in that sense, when the revenue comes in or the assessments come in, right off the bat, we proportion out an amount to the reserve fund and we proportion out an amount to the reserve fund. That could be 10%, 12.5%, maybe 15%. What I like about that method is what you can do is you can establish a board motion that says that each year we will set aside X percentage of the dues to go into the reserve fund. You can do it when you have a simple P&L and you treat the reserve as an expense line item. But it's much harder in that first option or the second, looking at having two separate P&L statements to keep the board from kind of making those tweaks year over year, right? It becomes a much more stable transfer of funds each year. So next slide, please. So how do we use the reserve funds? I mentioned it right at the beginning. We use it for capital improvement projects. These are the assets, the common assets whose functionality has to be repaired or replaced over time. So let's throw up the list of some of our typical assets. A lot of them we recognize. Pools, if we're gated, maybe we own the streets and have to repave them. Playgrounds, clubhouses, basketball, tennis courts, all pretty straightforward assets that we know as a community we're going to have to do maintenance on. Entrance monuments, they can become now a pretty considerable expense as developers create more elaborate entrance monuments with stone, essentially walls. They're almost like fortifications now at the entrances. Fencing, irrigation systems, little less thought about. Those can become fairly expensive in the maintenance and replacement of those systems. Pond fountains, aerators, all have an expense that we want to be setting aside funds year over year for their eventual replacement. And probably maybe the most important, and also, well, maybe not the most important, but one of the most forgotten about capital line items you might have is for landscaping. And we're not talking about mulching or replacing of flowers, but for those shrubs, bushes, trees, they become overgrown, right? They can become diseased, eventually die. A lot of communities have big green spaces, big wooded areas. Those are pretty large trees that could cost hundreds, if not thousands of dollars to maintain, cut down, trim back. And we want to be able to do those things because typically that common area that's wooded is adjacent to our residents' properties. And if we end up not maintaining it and we get trees that fall down right into our neighbor's yard, we can have a liability on our hands. So why do we need the reserve funds? Aside from the fact that Indiana law tells us we have to have some sort of reserve fund, it's really about the board's responsibility of preserving and enhancing the community. So reserve funds help us ensure assets are functional, safe, and usable. We all buy into a community expecting certain amount of service, so to speak. The pools are going to open at certain time periods. The playgrounds, the swings, and the play sets are going to be usable, right, and safe for our children. And so our funds help us do that. Provides financial transparency to the neighborhood. That more hits on the reserve study side, which we'll talk about coming up here in just a second. And it's a core component of preserving and increasing property values. This is especially true for our townhome, condo communities, or really any community that has maintenance responsibility of the exterior of our communities or our residence units, right? So it becomes pretty simple to think that a prospective person comes in, they take a look at the exterior, they say, looks like it needs painted, a new roof, maybe there's some wood rot, windows, the list can really be exhaustive, right? And then at that point, if it's the community's responsibility, then that resident would want to go to the community and understand when that's going to be, when that work's going to be done. So next slide. So we talk about a reserve fund very quickly. What is the reserve study? The reserve study is the plan, right, for how we use those funds for the repairing, replacing, and enhancing of those community-owned assets. Next slide. So it's a core component of the community's long-term financial plan, and we can really think about it from two areas or two perspectives. We can think about it from revenue and expense. So on a revenue side, it helps us answer questions about how much money is required in our reserve fund. What is that total balance we need year over year? 5,000, 50,000, 500,000? And then how much should we transfer to the reserve fund from our total assessment year over year? Is it $1,000, $5,000, $30,000? From the expense perspective, helps us establish the list of assets the community has responsibility for. So what is it going to cost to replace that component or do a project on our clubhouse to replace the roof? The reserve study helps us answer those questions. It helps us establish what the current condition of the asset is. Now I'll stop and note, if we have people that live in condos, high-rise communities, the reserve study is not a supplement or a replacement for an engineering assessment. The reserve study we'll look at the condition of the assets, kind of establish a poor, good, fair condition, which helps us determine kind of when we're going to need some additional funds for that asset to conduct the project. But it's not a total engineering assessment. And then finally, it tells us how often we'll need funds, which can be a little bit of a give and take between community members and the consultant that you use. So do we need money every 5 years, every 10 years, every 15 years? Reserve study helps us establish that. Next slide, please. So why do we need the reserve study? The reserve study helps us identify the common assets of the community, determine the remaining life, and assign a replacement cost, right, both now and in the future. So we'll inflate that value based upon an inflation number. Then we'll create a funding plan to make sure the community always has enough money to fund those upcoming projects without a bank loan or special assessment. So the goal is to maintain continuous funding over the time period that we look at, 30 years, 50 years, 100 years. We don't want to run out of funds, or we don't want to go below a certain threshold amount. We term it a reserve contingency that we hold back for emergencies. It's kind of an unallocated portion of our reserve fund for when projects come in over budget. We maintain that amount. And so we could establish that as the minimum. Next slide. What are the benefits of the reserve study? Takes the guesswork out of our long-term planning. So I live in a community. We've done 3 reserve studies. We have about 175 line items that represent projects that we need to do on the various assets around our community. We would not be able to figure out what we need to do each year or in the next 2 or 3 years without our reserve study. Next. Provides the framework for justifying the assessment and the need for fee increases. This is probably really important because the reserve fund can accumulate really large balances, and the community may ask the question, and they probably will ask the question, why do we need to adjust the dues when we have all this money sitting here, right? So the reserve study is the backup for the board to say, these are allocated monies and the money is going to these items. So, and that's your way of justifying the dues adjustment at that time. Provides for the repair and replacement of common assets. That kind of gets back up to number 1, where we want to stay on top of our maintenance, but we want to easily be able to identify what needs to be done and what can be pushed off to the next year. Next bullet. And it protects the board in the performance of their fiduciary duties, right? We're not, as Stephanie alluded to, we're not here to make a profit, right? We're also not here to generate a loss. So we don't want to generate too much in dues or too little. We're really looking for that Goldilocks amount that we want to be bringing in each year. And the reserve study for the reserve fund portion of our budget helps us establish what that value should be. And it improves home value. We did a study, or I did a little study a few years ago looking at communities that have reserve studies versus not, and the home appreciation between the two. There's a clear distinction or clear correlation between having a reserve study. This is really especially true when we start to talk about townhome communities, again, or condos. Again, when we think about the HOA having maintenance responsibility for the individual homeowner units. Next slide. Oh, we had one more bullet point, and it enhances the community. So when we think about enhancing the community, the reserve study is the perfect time to be thinking about the goals and the desires of the community. Do we want to create a larger entrance feature? Do we want to add a playground? Do we want to, I guess, add a pool? That'd be a pretty large expense. But the reserve study is the time when we can think about those items, build them into the plan, and really determine, is it going to be feasible for the community and what that trade-off is going to end up being. Now I think it's next slide. There we go. So when do we conduct a study? It's half a joke, half serious, but the best time to conduct a study was yesterday. If not yesterday, then today is the best time to do it. We really want to have a study on hand to help guide our budget development, guide the capital planning of our community. But in lieu of all of those things, I always say, let's do a reserve study in advance of our large capital projects. Not many times the community and the board want to do the projects first and then do the reserve study, which is fine. But I think it loses out on a lot of the benefit of bringing a consultant in, those second set of eyes, that expert to look at those projects and maybe structure them in a different way, or look at those projects in totality with everything else that has to be done in the community and offer a different suggestion. Maybe there's something more pressing. Maybe you think that the project should be in order of 1, 2, 3. Maybe your consultant comes back and says it's more efficient to go 3, 2, 1. We can have those discussions. If we come in after the fact, that those discussions can't end up occurring. So next slide. So how do we get a successful reserve study? It's important to be an active participant as a board member. because nobody knows the community better than you. You live in the community, you're there every day. When it's sunny, rainy, snowy, summer, winter, your community manager is probably the next best person, but they may not even be there every day. And certainly myself, I like to come on site to all of the communities that I go to, walk them, but that's really only a snapshot in time, 1 day, 2 days, maybe 3 days. And so you can't necessarily understand the full ins and outs, or I won't understand the full ins and outs as well as you as the board member. So I like to use a 3-step process to be an active participant. Step 1, provide information on community goals, needs, and desires, right? What is the outcome that we're looking to generate? What do we want to build in? And what do we want to see come from our reserve study? Step 2, provide historical information on project pricing. You may say that's a little self-serving because I use that information in the development of your report. Maybe it is a little, but one of the big barriers that I find to using a reserve study as a community and accepting it is the idea that the price of the project is wrong. It's not what we would end up paying. And so to alleviate that barrier, to remove that barrier, I say, let's use your pricing when it's available and good. Step 3, thoroughly review the list of assets, projects, and their components. So I caution every community manager and every board member and say, if it's not on the list, then there's no money for it, which that happens from time to time, and you make note of it and you pick it up the next time. But we want to be as complete as possible with the reserve study and the assets, the projects, the components that go into it, so that the funding model is as complete as possible and we don't have as many gaps. So again, if it's not in, review the list thoroughly, because if it's not there, there's no money for it. It becomes harder to build in on the back end. Next slide. Thank you. So outcomes and expectations, as we get here right to the end, everybody wants to know what a reserve study costs. I'll say it depends, like a good economist that I am, but it's typically between $3,000 and $5,000. I've done them for less than $3,000. I've done them for more. It becomes a function of the complexity. So the more, what I like to say is the more assets you have, the higher the cost will end up being. The more complex your association is, the more costly it'll be. So if you have a master association with sub-associations attached to it, that can be a driver of cost as well. I like to conduct a reserve study, or I like to say that a reserve study should be conducted every 3 to 5 years. In reality, it becomes a function of how comfortable you are with prices. And so we'll want to, once the pricing that you see, the benchmark pricing that you get in your reserve study becomes way off, then we want to think about a new one. That can be pretty difficult in the environment that we're in right now, because if you did a reserve study 2 years ago, we anticipated 3% inflation, and now we're at 9% or greater in some materials. It can be difficult to say, let's go back and do another one or make revisions, but it may be, depending on how the overall scope looks, maybe in your best interest at that point. So within the reserve study, we certainly want to see, within the full reserve study, we want to see items of the suggested assessment amount. What do we want? What do we need to be putting away, that contribution each year? Target ending reserve balances, which really I think becomes a big driver of when a reserve study becomes outdated. So we want to see, how are we trending against benchmark? So the reserve study says we're supposed to have accumulated X amount of funds. We're at Y. That delta is still something that we can manage year over year, right? When that divergence really starts to go, that's when we probably want to think about a new study. We also want to see a list of projects with their costs for a period of at least 10 years. Could be 20 years or 30 years, it just becomes a printout, but certainly if we're using a reserve study that's 20 years old, it's probably outdated and not as accurate as a new one. And then that complete list of projects, right, including some information about our replacement cost, its lifespan, first year of replacement. A lot of that information is kind of inherent, but we'll want to look it over and check it, feel comfortable with that information as presented. So I think we have one more slide. So some final thoughts as we close it out. even communities with the perceived few amount of assets should have a reserve study. I purposely put in the word perceived because typically when I come in, the board thinks there's, 5 or 6 assets, but then as we really dive into it, we find out that there's a lot more assets that they end up maintaining. So maybe they want to do some landscaping enhancements, so we throw that in there. I mentioned the landscaping up front. Maybe we discover that we own the streets, or the community owns the street signs and street lights, so we need to build funding in for that. Those things tend to come out through the reserve study. Knowingly or unknowingly underfunding the reserves, in my opinion, is the breach of our fiduciary responsibility. We want to be good stewards of our neighbors' money, efficient with that money. And in reality, if we are underfunding our reserves, there's one of 3 outcomes. We take a loan to pay for the projects, which in that case probably means we need a reserve study anyways, or else we're not going to get the bank loan. We'll do a special assessment to pay for the projects, or we're going to reduce the service or asset quality. So we don't open the pools, we close down the park, the streets have more potholes in them, right? Those are kind of the outcomes that happen. And then finally, the reserve study is a guide. So it's not every line item is going to be accurate, but we want to treat it as a living document. So the boards that are the best at it learn how to interpret the study, pull money forward, shift money back, and make those adjustments in real time, year over year, and compare it against the benchmarks that we've established through the reserve study. So that was quick, but hopefully we left a little time to review. We got a couple minutes and questions that might be out there.
Okay, Matt, I've got a couple questions. And
Yes, sir.
since I was answering questions on I wasn't listening as much as I should have, so I'm sorry. I'll listen to I'll watch the Zoom later. One of the questions was that they had a reserve study done last year with a projection inflation of 2.6%. We all know that's not working. So what do we do with the reserve study projection costs?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it really becomes, do we feel comfortable over the long term? I don't think we're going to be anticipating 9% inflation for 5 or 6 years. Over the short term, that really starts to put us behind the 8 ball in terms of how the reserve advisor is projecting costs versus the reality of those costs, because we know costs aren't going to come back down, right? Our hope is that the costs just don't keep going up at the rate they've been going. So the one thing that I would look to from an overall perspective is look at those, whatever's been established for the target ending reserve balance each year. Do we need, 150,000? Do we need 200,000? Right? And benchmark that against where your project costs are coming in and what your actual balance is year over year. When that really starts to diverge, that's when we know on the whole, the reserve study, the project costs are way off, and we're not just dealing with kind of a one-off for a year or a one-off on an individual line item.
Okay, thank you. I do have a question here, and everyone, that is 1 o'clock, and I know some people have to get back to work. We will be sending out the PowerPoint and a video of this presentation to all the attendees. So, and also it's going to be on our KMC YouTube channel, which also has all of our webinars from the last year and a half. So just in case you have to get off and come back later. One of the questions for Matt is, what's the difference between a reserve study and a budget and cost analysis? The RFP we received listed them separately with a separate cost.
A budget and a cost analysis.
Okay, I didn't know that one either. So
I need a little more information there. It sounds as if budget cost analysis is kind of like an abbreviated reserve study potentially.
Yeah. Okay, that's good. One question that I didn't actually know what he was talking about was, what type of reserve accounts do you prefer? Component versus pooled?
So I think when I talk about, there are really 2 kind of accounts that I think of, and maybe it's a terminology thing. So we have either a component or an allocation. Maybe that's the pooled, what we're thinking about. So a component, think of it as a kind of a defined piece of an asset. So it's easy to think about a clubhouse has a roof. A roof replacement and the roof in general is a component of the actual clubhouse. An allocation is really kind of where we're not quite sure. There's not really a defined parameter for the funding, and maybe that's when we start talking about pooled. So, for instance, wood rot on a clubhouse, we don't really know every year or every 3 or 5 years how much wood rot there's going to end up being, but we know there's some, right? And so we want to have an allocation of funds that allows us to go and do that maintenance. And maybe we end up using that money, and maybe we use all of it, maybe we use a little more, or maybe we don't have to use any of it. So maybe that's where he's going in terms of allocation, pooled versus component.
Okay, and one more, and I think you discussed this, but just a little more detail on it. Should a neighborhood carry a minimum reserve for unexpected expenses? If so, how should that be figured?
Yeah, so that's a great question. You probably always want to have some sort of minimum that's greater than 0 that we'd want to keep as some sort of contingency amount. And there's a number of schools of thought that we can think about there. All of which, though, should be established, in my opinion, by some sort of board motion. So that way the board then is in agreement that it needs to be this value, and then to override that decision, right, we take another board motion, so another agreement amongst the board members. But in terms of what that value should be, it could be just a simple percentage that you think is reasonable, say 10%, 15%, maybe it's of your overall dues or the dues that you contribute each year. When you get into townhome condo communities, we start to deal with the insurance policies. And so if there's the insurance policy that it's your deductible is 1% or maybe 2% of the replacement value of the asset, not of the project, right? So for instance, the example becomes nobody is probably ever going to replace their roof on their own. We're going to wait for a hailstorm now, right? And we'll replace it under insurance. So if we have a 1 or 2% deductible on the roof replacement project, we could end up paying 33 or 66% of the cost of that project, right? And a hailstorm could happen year over year. So maybe that becomes the amount that you want to end up keeping in your reserves as that minimum, right? So it's a $100,000 project to replace the roof. Your deductible is we'll say it's $33,000 or $66,000, right? You'd want to keep that amount as a reserve contingency. So you always have the ability to end up paying for that project.
All right, Matt, thank you so much. Stephanie, I'm going to send it back to you.
All right. Thank you, Dan. And thank you all for attending today. We appreciate everybody's attendance. Thank you for taking your lunch hour to do this. Great questions. I was just scrolling through some of the Q&A myself. So thank you all. Please feel free to reach out to your managers, to their regional managers, if you have any questions about your budgets, about reserve studies. We are here to partner with you and help you get the best budget for 2023. So thank you all. Have a wonderful afternoon.